Over Christmas, I spent a few weeks in Wales and England, and during my time there, I visited the University of Bristol to have a conversation with the eminent historian and author, Professor Ronald Hutton, whose work I've long admired. I wanted to talk with him partly because I'm fascinated by obscure British holidays and how they add color, meaning, enchantment, and fun to the calendar, a topic on which Professor Hutton is the world's leading authority. If you happen to share this interest, I highly recommend his 1996 book, The Stations of the Sun, A History of the Ritual Year in Britain. You'll hear me mention this book during our conversation. Professor Hutton and I also discuss his newest book, Queens of the Wild, Pagan Goddesses in Christian Europe, an Investigation. We met in his university office on Plough Monday, which incidentally is one of those obscure British holidays that I love. It's quite interesting to track the changes in 19th and 20th century scholarly opinion about whether there was a surviving pagan religion in post-medieval Christian Europe, or rather mere remnants of defunct pagan religions showing up in European folkways. And if there were only such remnants, whether they were few and far between or abundant. In your new book, Queens of the Wild, you trouble this conversation, rather helpfully, in my view, by highlighting figures who seem neither Christian nor pagan. Could you talk a little bit about the changes in prevailing scholarly opinion on these issues from the late 19th century to the present, and maybe describe how your own thinking has developed in recent years?
Well, the negative aspect of the late 20th century research was that it did away with the late Victorian, early 20th century scholarly belief in surviving paganism, i.e. that a self-conscious, fully formed pagan religion had survived in various different bits of Europe, way into the Christian period, especially among common people. The evidence for that was reviewed not by me, but by an extraordinary range of different scholars in the late 20th century, and it was rejected because the evidence was found to be inadequate. But most professional historians, folklorists, literary experts, by the 1990s, preserved the different notion of pagan survivals, including myself, meaning an incredible range of images, ideas, motifs, and forms that had been taken over by medieval Christian society from the pagan ancient world at all levels and persisted, digested into Christian society, sometimes with more ease than at other points. In some traditions, like ritual magic, were never officially accepted and respectable, and survived as a genuine clandestine movement. My take on the question of definitions in the last 20 years has shifted to the extent of thinking that the pagan Christian terminology has got a bit polarized, and the Middle Ages were a more complicated place, as you've said. I draw attention to figures in medieval, early modern European culture who don't really fit the framework of being Christian, but nor do they seem to be survivals from the pagan ancient world. They're thoroughly pagan-looking figures, especially goddess-like figures, who seem to have evolved within a nominally Christian society.
You know, on the one hand, some commentators have insisted that pagan beliefs and practices survived out there in the mystical countryside as populations diffused across the land or stayed in place and simply maintained their lore, beliefs, practices against all odds. But some of these thinkers also seem to subscribe to the Jungian or Yeatsian notion that there's a collective memory, a reservoir of images, or what we might think of as a grammar of belief and ritual alive in the human psyche itself that accounts for the prominence of certain patterns among peoples that have been geographically and culturally isolated from one another. And it struck me at some point that there's tension within this position because if you have this collective unconscious, or anima mundi to use Yeats's term, you don't really need surviving paganism to explain the way certain motifs crop up again and again all over the place. The stuff of myth and ritual would rise up from the collective psyche regardless on this account. It seems that some thinkers, including me, I think, at one point in my life, for some reason have needed both things to be true, and as a result have advanced a confused argument that so-called pagan survivals result somehow both from the refusal of rural people to relinquish their pre-Christian beliefs and practices and from how the collective human memory works with or without diffusion or the refusal to abandon the old ways. Have you noticed this tension?
I hadn't noticed it in exactly the way in which you framed it, but I have noticed several lines of tension running through the interpretation of culture, and especially with reference to historical survival and development. The Jungian position of collective unconscious and timeless archetypes is an interesting hypothesis. It remains unproven objectively in the way that Jung stated it, but it remains a possibility. Certainly there are certain patterns that the human mind does evolve worldwide, and without any need for diffusion. Sir James Frazer, the often much criticized author of The Golden Bough, the most popular work of anthropology ever written, was, I think, correct in identifying worldwide with attitudes to magic a sense of a difference between contagious magic, in which things transmit power. So if you want to bewitch somebody, you get hold of their hair clippings or their nail clippings, and also a common attachment to the idea of signs or reference. In other words, a leaf that is shaped like a lung on a plant is probably going to be good for curing diseases of the lungs. Now, patterns like that, and Fraser picked up on others, are found worldwide by peoples with no contacts with each other. So I think the human mind does work in very similar ways worldwide, but of course is also capable of producing almost endless differences, some of substance and others of detail.
One thing I've noticed about you, and I wonder whether you would agree with this characterization, is that you champion human creativity. You strike me as being especially interested in how human beings of various periods have created traditions, made things up, and improvised new forms, rather than spending all your time tracing how the alleged archetypes have manifested themselves.
I do champion creativity. I encourage people actively to take older materials and get new forms out of them, because I personally find the results inspiring and deeply satisfying. I think also, like a lot of my generation, I was reacting against the extraordinarily patronizing view of country people taken by genteel 19th and early 20th century scholars, starting with the great German folklorists and collectors, including Brothers Grimm and Wilhelm Meinhardt, evolving the idea that country people basically can't think, and therefore they mindlessly repeat the same rituals and beliefs millennium after millennium. This ran up not just against my own view of human nature and that of others, and a sense of what a dynamic place the countryside can be. I grew up in it myself. But also a sense of how dynamic oral cultures are. Illiterate or largely illiterate communities are often a lot more culturally dynamic and capable of mutation than highly literate communities. Because if you don't write things down, they aren't recorded, and so they can mutate much more rapidly and easily.
Absolutely. I've noticed the same thing. I've gathered a great deal of folklore in rural Arkansas, where I'm from. Like you, I grew up in the country, and I've noticed time and again the dynamic that you just described, you'll get many versions of the same story, and you can see the storytellers playing with each other's ideas. One storyteller hears another and thinks, yeah, you did pretty well with that opening, but I think I can soup up this middle part here. And then somebody else comes along and fiddles with the ending, and the stories, which are living things, change and move. And in fact, I've noticed that my grandmother would start telling me a story, and she would tell it, retell it again, all in one session. She would tell it like 5 times in one sitting, and it would get better with each successive iteration. She was just crafting that thing as I sat and listened. And incidentally, she was teaching me, her aspiring writer of a grandson, something about revision while she was at it. While we're on these topics, I wanted to ask you, I noticed that Rupert Sheldrake and you are both patrons of the British Pilgrimage Trust. I interviewed Rupert earlier on this trip in Hampstead. Are you familiar by chance with his idea of morphic resonance?
I am. I know him personally. He's been very kind to me. He's a scientist. I'm not. And therefore I listen with wonder, love, and awe to scientific hypotheses without having the least idea of how to evaluate. Morphic resonance might be perfectly correct. It explains a lot of things. It harmonizes with a lot of what many people see as reality. How it works as science, I'm not in a position to comment.
The reason I'm bringing it up is that it struck me that it may propose an interesting resolution of the tension we were just talking about. When you see a folkloric form emerging in rural Britain, is it a pagan survival? Is it pagan? Or is it this thing that someone tuned into in the collective unconscious? Rupert's idea, in a way, brings those two together, because I think he would say, you don't need the thing to have survived in continuous practice, but you are likelier to tune into your personal ancestors' folkloric practices and ideas than to somebody else's ancestors' folkloric practices and ideas. Because morphic resonance proposes resonance on the basis of similarity.
I think that's true, but I would also never underestimate the ability of stories to travel, and travel between very different cultures. This can take the form of material objects as well. When I was younger, one of the European objects from prehistory, which was most regularly wheeled out conceptually as an example of Celtic pagan art, is the Gundestrup cauldron in Copenhagen, found in a Danish bog. But in recent decades, it's been shown in terms of metallurgy to have been made beside the Black Sea, at the far end of Europe. And some of the designs on it are clearly taken from India. There's an elephant on it, for example, and the design of a cross-legged god surrounded by animals is also found in the Indus Valley. And where visual designs can travel, spoken stories can travel even faster. And so tales have been circulating across Eurasia for thousands of years. And they can transplant far more readily at the present day. Now we have a more global society. This was already happening in the late 18th century. The proprietor of the Royal Goat Hotel at Beddgelert in North Wales noted no visitors were coming to Beddgelert at a time when the tourist industry was becoming important to North Wales. And he realized that the place needed a story. And so he took an Indian story of the faithful hound of a prince who was killed by his royal master after he had saved the prince's baby from a wolf, because the master didn't see the dead wolf and thought the dog had been responsible for the blood in the chamber and overturning the cradle. And it's a tearjerker. And the hotel proprietor relocated it to North Wales, and a North Welsh prince, a famous one. And it brought the tourists in their hordes, and after a few years, people began asking to see the grave of the dog, and so the proprietor dug the grave and set up the memorial, and the tourist industry was complete. And that's an example of something from half a world away being transplanted with superlative success.
See, I agree with this. And I think sometimes when it comes to the moment of engaging in a creative act, you can be more readily seduced by something that's unfamiliar because it's new and interesting. And in fact, I had a friend in college who said, I'm interested in anything spiritual except Christianity. Because to her, she had just been kind of beaten over the head with Christianity all her life, and she didn't connect aesthetically. And so in order to write about something spiritual, write about something mystical, she needed to connect with a tradition not her own.
That's a very common pattern, a very useful one.
And Christianity itself, after all, is syncretistic. Many of these forms we think of as ancestral turn out to be syncretistic and examples of cultural mixing.
Yeah, and very diverse. If you compare a Quaker meeting with the Roman Catholic Mass, they're barely recognizable as the same religion.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Your new book, Queens of the Wild, came out in late May of 2022, if I'm not mistaken. What sorts of responses have you gotten so far from other scholars and just from readers in general?
They've liked it. That's kind of all I know. The critical reception to books tends to be a bit delayed. With most books, especially those that invite quite a wide readership, the initial reviews are in newspapers and public journals, and they're very often by well-known reviewers and literary figures who aren't personally expert in the subject concerned, and therefore tend to be generous. And then the real experts weigh in after a year or two in the academic journals, and that's when the debate begins. So it's all a bit soon for my recent book.
In the conclusion of the new book, you mentioned that Christians, devout Christians, in Europe have proved quite capable of conjuring and cherishing folkloric presences that are neither pagan nor Christian. This made me think of an experience I had gathering folklore in the Delta region of eastern Arkansas. One Sunday, I attended a church service, and afterward there was a potluck dinner. I sat down at the table with some folks I knew very well and whom I knew to be devout Christians. And they commenced to tell me a story about their home. They said it was a haunted house and told incredible stories about mirrors flying through the air and doing twirls all by themselves in the air and all manner of strange phenomena occurring inside that house. And as I listened, I remembered the sermon we had just heard in the church service, which was about what happens after you die. The preacher had told us, of course, about heaven and hell. So I asked these folks whether they thought they had a ghost in their house, and they said most definitely they had a ghost, maybe several ghosts. I said, well, how do you fit that into the scheme of things that we just heard about in church, namely that people die and go either to heaven or to hell? And it was very interesting, and I thought beautiful the way these folks simply flicked my question away. I mean, they looked at me with amusement and bemusement as if I had walked into a party wearing ridiculous clothing. They refused even to acknowledge that there was anything troubling or disruptive about the tension between their ghost story and the preacher's sermon. It made me wonder whether one of folklore's primary functions might be to hold open the possibility of imagining beyond what we're told by authority figures in our spiritual traditions. I'm bringing this up because it connects, in my mind, with what you've uncovered in your new book. I wonder whether the goddesses you've written about embody, at least in part, the possibility of imagining and creating beyond the inherited stories. And really, your goddesses are more apt embodiments of this because not only do they not hearken back to Christianity, they don't even hearken back to pre-Christian religion or lore. What do you think about this idea?
I think that sounds very convincing. Ghosts are a difficult kind of parallel for my goddess-like figures because they are genuinely ancient. They are a pagan survival, and Christianity struggled to assimilate them all through the Middle Ages and early modern period. It became much easier for medieval Catholicism to do it because it developed the idea of purgatory as a halfway house, And that included the extension that certain types of sinner would be given their purgatory by wandering the earth, by haunting it, so you can bring ghosts right back into the frame. But Protestants threw ghosts out completely, because they went back to Scripture and decided that it's either everyone's in kind of suspended animation till the Last Judgment, or everybody's going straight to heaven and hell, Scripture itself being rather indeterminate on this point. And therefore ghosts could exist, but only as demons, taking the form of the dead person. And this idea struggled with popular belief that these are literally the spirits of dead people, all through modernity. I think I'm looking at something a bit different with the figures in the recent book, in that these are figures, as I've commented, that do not apparently seem to be direct survivals from the pagan ancient world, but they look thoroughly pagan. And they're occupying a kind of empty space which Christianity couldn't touch. And they provide an alternative resource to it. Now, what kind of label you hang around that is up to you. I can't imagine any consensus is likely to emerge soon among scholars. But it is quite a widespread and quite an interesting phenomenon, which I felt hadn't really been faced up to properly because of the labeling game.
I like the way you put the onus on the scholars who want to present these goddess figures as pagan survivals. It's really the responsibility of those scholars to show that a particular folkloric or literary character is, in fact, a pagan survival.
Yeah, the discussion I carry on about the nature of surviving paganism and pagan survival it is a dispute within a family, because this is not a tradition developed by ordinary people, the tradition of surviving paganism in the Christian period. It's developed by intellectuals, often academics, in my own culture, in a period only about 130 years ago. And these are my people. They belong to my institutions. I belong to the same London club, which most of them inhabited. I've regularly spoken in the same buildings and on the same podia from which they have addressed audiences. They are my own breed. And so if I'm challenging things that my people have produced, rather than turning a critical eye upon traditions held by and developed by other groups of people in my own society or outside it.
Yeah, this reminds me of something you've noticed in the work of certain folklorists of the 19th and 20th centuries, namely that the debates among them were limited by oversimplifications or one-size-fits-all explanations on different sides of the argument. If, for instance, a folklorist saw everything that's the least bit arcane as a case of surviving paganism, well, that's probably too simple an explanation or a kind of totalizing narrative. At the same time, you've identified an error on the other side of the argument in the work of folklorists who wanted to chalk everything up to class struggle. But you seem grateful for all of this work, and you make what strikes me as an astute observation that some scholars are fueled by an intense interest that is derived, at least in large part, from an error of some kind at the heart of their work. If, for example, the admittedly intriguing notion of surviving paganism is what drives a given scholar to do her research, and if her research, despite whatever flaws it may have, turns out to have been quite valuable, well then the error has had its utility. And as I pondered this point, I started thinking about you and your scholarly stance, because it seems to me that you've assiduously avoided these kinds of grand narratives to explain everything or, one-size-fits-all explanations. Instead, you're remarkably even-handed, and you'll often credit various arguments that have been deployed to explain certain phenomena in the historiography or the folklore, whatever it is. And you've even speculated that at times this has been to your own detriment because, let's face it, readers like it when scholars throw firecrackers and make controversial arguments, which raises the question, if you're not relying on these totalizing explanations to fuel your research, then what is it exactly that drives you? Like, what is it that gets you going in the morning and keeps you interested in this stuff?
It's a romantic passion for particular subjects in history, which I developed in late childhood and early adolescence by looting the local public libraries and attending guest lectures and watching very rudimentary black and white television documentaries, shows, series like Chronicle, and the earlier archaeological panel shows of the late 1950s, early 1960s. These fascinated me. But also there's a generational element in my relationship with the older scholarship, because in many ways my relations with people like Sir Edward Tyler, Sir James Fraser, I could reel off the names in each area in which I research, the great ancestors of my profession, my discipline. It's rather like my being somebody reared in the household of a Republican-voting, church-attending, white-collar family who becomes a hippie.
Right.
And so there's this sense of rejecting the values of the older generation while still recognizing that you're their children.
Right.
But nonetheless, there's quite a gap. There's quite a response. And it is significant that when I was in my teens, I believed completely practically everything that I later wrote against when I examined the evidence. I mean, there are conversion moments in this process, the kind of thing that can make somebody suddenly leave the Eisenhower voting or LBJ voting home and head out for San Francisco and A Summer of Love. For me, there are a number of such moments. One of the most obvious was when I was in the first winter of my PhD thesis, which was on the English Civil War. And I suddenly realized that two of the battles of the English Civil War had never happened. They were in all the textbooks about a particular region of England as having taken place. And I'd found the dispatches of the allegedly victorious general showing he was doing nothing at the time and fighting nobody. But the battles had been put into propaganda pamphlets prepared by his side back in London at a time when it was losing and they needed to invent some victories. And people had believed these lies. And I had one of people's great trust nobody over 30 moments at that moment. I wasn't alone. Conrad Russell, Bertrand Russell's son, one of the great historians of the early Stuart period of English history in the late 20th century, said around 1972, he suddenly realized that he could believe that the kings Charles I and James I had existed, along with an accompanying cast of characters and events, but he couldn't believe anything else he'd ever read about them. He had to start again from beginning and check every fact. And that was the mood of a generation.
I saw an interview with you once in which you recounted a moment when I believe one of your undergraduate professors said to you, you have a real sense of history. And if you keep at it, you can do important work, something like that. Would you be so kind as to tell that story and then explain what you think he or she meant by that comment?
Okay. The context is I was a poor boy from Essex, which is not one of the most prestigious of English counties. It's not really the Arkansas of England. It's more like the New Jersey of England. It's beside the capital.
Bruce Springsteen.
Yeah, it's very blue collar.
Mm-hmm.
And I worked my way through the state school system, the public school system, and got myself a scholarship to Cambridge, which was supposed to be the best university in the country at that time. But I was very nervous there. when I went up, 87% of the students in my college had been privately educated, very expensively, and most of the remaining 13%, which included me from the state system, were northern scientists who formed a clique together. So I had no place there. And I had no idea where I was going. I had no idea if I was any good. And near the end of my second year there, one of the tutors I had whom I most respected said that I had a real sense of the tragedy of history, of the narrative power of history, and that if I kept working at it, then one day I might be one of the leading historians in the world. And this was an airburst, as far as I was concerned. It transformed my landscape. It didn't give me a sense of self-confidence or purpose. It seemed utterly unreal. But I felt, I sleepwalked my way into this position. If I keep on working really hard and just keep on trucking, then something might happen, and it did.
What do you think the tutor meant exactly? What does that mean, a sense of the tragedy of history?
He was a devout Roman Catholic. He actually jettisoned the academic profession within a year and became a priest. And he felt that there was a meaning to all this stuff. And there was also a romance to it, an excitement and engagement. And that what my work had given him was a sense that I was emotionally engaged, that I had a sense that this stuff mattered, that it was alive, it was real, and he wanted me to pick up on that, carry on. I mean, he was telling somebody who thought that he had no prospects. I thought initially of being a lawyer and realized I couldn't because I couldn't afford it. My family was too poor.
That story made me think of a story I heard about an American journalist named Tim Russert, who grew up, I think, in working-class Buffalo.
Yeah.
And he was working for a politician named Daniel Patrick Moynihan, a very prominent one in the States. And he was the only young staff member who hadn't been educated at the Ivies. And Moynihan saw that he was struggling with self-confidence and just to fit in, and took him aside one day and said, "Tim, what these folks know from Harvard and Yale, you can learn. But what you know from Buffalo, they're going to have a hell of a time trying to learn."
I never thought of it that way. It's a really interesting insight.
Yeah. One thing that I found tremendously interesting in Stations of the Sun is the idea that some of the stuff that looked to folklorists like pagan survivals or maybe even surviving paganism was actually forbidden Christian practices, ritual practices, being transferred from the church into the home after the Reformation.
Yeah.
Could you say a little bit about that for viewers who maybe haven't read the book and might be enticed to read it after hearing you talk about it?
Basically, what I realized was that a certain amount of later, that's post-Reformation folklore, were actually medieval Catholic Church rituals, which had been carried on informally by people when they were forbidden to have them enacted for them in church. And this was part of the way in which people acclimatized to the Reformation.
And I like your suggestion that while it may at first seem surprising that these originally Catholic rituals flourished in parts of Wales where Catholicism itself had not, this might be precisely the point, namely that it became necessary for the folks to move these rituals into their homes only in areas where the Catholic Church was no longer performing and hosting the rituals, which is to say, in Protestant areas. Am I getting that right?
It's one of the things I was saying, yes. You're spot on there.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And I wonder whether I was thinking about, do you know Philip Larkin's poem Churchgoing?
Yeah.
I was thinking about that and thinking about this burgeoning pilgrimage movement here in England and, well, across Britain and then across Europe.
Yeah.
And Sheldrake told me the numbers. They're stunning, how fast this movement is growing and how enthusiastic it is. it seems to me that that poem, at least, let's not say Larkin, but the poem would be surprised by what's happening with pilgrimage. Do you think something like this could happen with tip-tearing and mummery and the like?
Oh, it's happened. There's been an enormous folk revival in the last 20, 30 years. Take something that's taking off at this very minute, which is kind of early to mid-January. Here, it's apple wassailing. When I wrote Stations the Sun, published in 96, it was preserved only at 3 places in the West Country, and it was itself the only remnant of a wider tradition of wassailing, which had embraced not just orchards, but all types of farmlands. And then I wrote the book, and very slightly helped by the book, but generally by a need for more community-based rituals, apple wassailing has engulfed the West Country and South Wales. So there are now literally scores of events being advertised for the public, and probably hundreds going on, including the private celebrations. So it really is a change.
I was thinking about this yesterday because I met with a mummer here in Bristol, my friend Gavin Skinner, and he represents, I think, that creativity that you champion. He wrote a mumming play, and I interviewed 2 mummers about 4 years ago, and one of them is very much of the preservationist cast of mine, and Skinner says, let's innovate, let's have fun with these forms, let's write new mumming plays. The other guy scoffed at that idea. It's like, you don't write a mumming play. You preserve a mumming play. And Gavin said, well, what do you think happens? They grow from a seed? Like somebody has to write them. And he really, he likes the idea that we can have fun with these forms and keep them going.
I think both attitudes are entirely valid. And there's also a very obvious blend or compromise between them, which is that you keep the basic mumming cast of characters and the basic action, and you then reshape the lyrics to fit a changing social and political scene.
That's exactly the thought I had. I'm so thankful for both guys.
Yeah.
That they're both there. I think that's really the best kind of tension around a tradition like that. He showed me a manifestation of the Green Man, which you write about in your new book, here in Bristol. And he says he's going to be able to dance as part of that festival in May this year, I think. He and his son both. So, yeah, it's happening right here in Bristol.
Lovely. I hope to attend.
This is a question that my a student at SMU, Lindsay McClure, wanted me to ask you, and I wanted to ask you too. It's sort of a composite of a question I had and one she had. There's a magic for me to this word carol. And so I wonder, like, what distinguishes a carol in your mind from any other folk song? And Lindsay wondered, do you have a favorite carol or folk song that you've worked with or written about?
To answer the latter question first, I'm completely unoriginal. I do like the holly and the ivy, but then an awful lot of people do at the present day because of its blend of folk Christianity with the natural world. Carols are seasonal songs, sung in the street or door to door, rather than folk songs in general. They begin as a dance, invented by St. Francis's people, the Franciscan friars, not too long after Francis's time in the 13th century, as a missionary ploy to get people happy with Christianity. And think about it. It's a round dance. You link hands, and you dance in a ring, singing. And you sing Christian themes. And this caught on as an entertainment. After a couple of 100 years, people got bored with the dance, and they ditched it, but they kept up the songs. And there were May carols, Halloween carols, midsummer carols. But they died out because it really was at the midwinter season that people most needed extra earnings to be earned by singing. And that still goes on, of course. If I have carol singers singing in the street about my house now, collecting, they're almost always collecting now on behalf of a good, recognized charity rather than pocketing the proceeds for their family.
I noticed that you wrote a little bit about Yeats in the new book, And a couple of things about Yeats came to mind as I was reading your new book. One is something that happened one time when he was giving a public speech. He said, the only good thing you can say about the Protestant Reformation is that it gave rise to the Renaissance. And one person who was there had the temerity to point out that he had reversed the order of history.
Yes.
And Yeats, unflappable, said, "Look at O'Brien here. He's the sort of man who would bring down the Archangel Gabriel in full flight with a brickbat of fact."
Well, if the archangel concerned is capable of being brought down by a fact, then maybe somebody should lob a fact at him and see what's happened. Yeats is my favorite poet, but he didn't take critics lightly, and he didn't have much time for facts himself. And it could be quite an acerbic combination. I think what doomed Yeats for me as a dinner party companion was Max Beerbohm's recollection of him, Beerbohm being a more perceptive, more altruistic writer at the same time, who was entertained with Yeats at a dinner thrown by a very eager to please and soft-centered young female hostess. And Yeats just held forth with a monologue about diabolism, the danger of devil worship, which he pronounced diabolism, and never bothered to thank the hostess for her dinner. And to Beerbohm, that was unforgivable. And I kind of see Beerbohm's point.
Yes. But I read somewhere that he went over to Oscar Wilde's home and scared the children by having too intense a nature and telling too many Irish ghost stories.
Yes, intensity was one of Yeats's hallmarks.
He's also one of my favorite poets, and one thing he says in the introduction to his collection of fairy lore that I wondered what you might think about is that he's included some Irish poetry about fairies, and it's more like the Scottish than the English. And he says that the English fairies are romantic bubbles from Provence. No one ever laid new milk on the doorstep from them. No one ever believed in them. So he wants to draw this bright line between English fairy lore and Irish fairy lore. What do you think about that?
It's true and it's not. Yeats, of course, never read any early modern sources, including legal records in England, in which the fairies appear as frighteningly real. They're certainly not imported literary figures. On the other hand, fairies tend to get bigger and tougher the further north and west in the British archipelago you go. And by the time you get to the subsistence family farms of the Scottish Highlands and Islands and parts of Wales and Ireland, fairy stories are survival mechanisms. They're not just entertainment. So there is a difference in degree.
You mentioned terror, and in one of your books you mentioned that one of the truly ancient dimensions of the British ritual year, or one of the ancient features of it, is the feeling of the sense of death and the uncanny in the fall and winter. Is terror the terror we associate with Punky Night and Halloween? Is that an old part of the ritual year? Is that a newfangled kind of
It's
thing?
very old, and it's associated with two very different seasons. One is the obvious one where it remains, which is the beginning of winter, the Halloween season, because of the fear of the most unpleasant of all the seasons, which in a traditional northern society in a good year would still mean dirt, vermin, claustrophobia, unemployment, and cold and darkness. And in a bad year meant death from famine or hypothermia or epidemics. The other scary season is late summer, early autumn, after midsummer, because of the proliferation of insect life then, which brings bubonic plague, typhus, and malaria. But also the crops are tall enough to be destroyed by bad weather or disease. The animals have been out in the outfields or the summer pastures long enough to catch epidemics and die. and it's the fighting and the raiding season for warrior human communities. So it is particularly scary.
One thing that your work helped me concretize in my mind or understand more deeply is that the way that the terror of the Halloween season comes right before Christmas teaches us that terror is an ingredient in awe. There's a magic to the rhythm of that and the way it plays out. And I, as a poet and a literary person, I love the way you embody the liberal arts in your work, often bringing in song and poetry. And your work has meant a lot to me and to several of my friends back in Arkansas and Texas. So I just wanted to thank you, Ronald Hutton, for the work you've done, which is so good and varied, and for your time today.
I'm very touched. Thank you very much indeed.